Welcome to Module 7, where we're going to study the environmental health, which is the fifth discipline we'll study that is part of our public health world. And I've labeled this doing well and getting better. That is a statement that I feel like that I can make here in 2021. If I had to make that statement in 1970, I would have said, it's really, really bad and it's getting worse, would have been the label of my conversation. But a lot of great things happened 50 years ago in 1970, and we'll talk about those throughout our discussion here today. Providing a clean environment is essential to the best health outcomes, and it's essential function of our government also. As towns and cities became, more prevalent and there's more people, local governments and even sometimes state governments couldn't manage this super well. So we engaged and really just began, I think, in earnest in the 1970s, where we engaged federal government to assist on this. So what is the role of government in environmental health? This is really, as we just explained, is beyond the control of individuals. I mean, an individual alone or a group of people are not going to be able to control a large ecosystem that's our environment with that. So, local governments provide clean water and disposal of waste. As populations grew, it became too big for local governments to manage that. And as we've talked about here, and we'll continue to talk about in the 60s and 70s, the federal and state governments took more responsibility. The Environmental Protection Agency was founded. And again, we'll look at more details of that as we work through this lecture. And we'll talk about this in the end, the last thing we talk about, but population growth has led to, some environmental problems that we'll mention here. And this last one, depletion of the Earth's ozone layer and accumulation of greenhouse gases says it's a major concern. There's some debate on that, what that really entails and how bad that really is, but I'll leave that up to your own research and judgment. So again, to speak, lots of times when this lecture is given, I mean, people are thinking about the chemicals that they get exposed to, and it's this huge danger. And again, 50 years ago, I would think that maybe some of that was justified, but we do such a great job these days of tracking and reporting on, things about, air quality, water quality, waste disposable quality, how we're doing, how it's impacting the environment. And this is a screenshot from the EPA, I'll call it environmental surveillance. But if you go to their site, and I recommend that you do that, you can see, for example, here I've just searched my particular zip code, which is Anaheim, California, 92808. I can see here that, my air quality today is going to be good. Forecast is a little bit later is moderate. And then you compare that to what it was like in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. You see there that it has improved, very much so. And I can speak from experience. I moved out here in 1990. We used to have smog alerts, level 1, level 2, red, yellow, orange, where you could see the pollution in the air. Since then, today it's nothing like that. We don't have smog alerts, that sort of thing anymore. So you see also here that it covers water, and this, if you scroll down at the website, it also covers land use and a couple other things. So we're going to look at here initially, before we get into specifics on air quality and water quality and food and drug quality, we're going to look at just some common or prominent environmental hazards. And I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm no expert on chemical makeups and etc. But we'll go through these and talk a little bit about what each one of these are and where you might find them and get exposure to those. Again, the EPA sets standards on all this, and we'll get into more detail of that as we go through here. So the first thing we'll look at real quick is radiation. And I'll move through this pretty quickly. I mean, radon gas is something that you likely are not going to get a huge exposure to, but the statistics are that like 21,000 people die from cancer each year from exposure to radon gas. Now, what is radon gas? It is a natural gas that comes up through the rock and the soil underneath uh, your house, and if it comes through at high levels, that can give you exposure or make you more likely to get certain cancers. You know, again, probably not something to learn about. You can get your house tested for that. Um, I'm going to go to the chronic exposure to radiation techs. Again, they've shown those that have higher exposure to radiation have higher incidence of lung cancer and other cancers. And then just the study that was done that confirmed the that radiation is not good is the Hiroshima bombings in Japan. Mercury is another substance. Uh, you know, Mercury caused neurological damage in some workers in Japan in the 1950s. Now, let me put this into context for you, is that following that event, it was used to better understand how mercury was excreted from plastics. It was thrown in the ocean, it polluted waters, etc. Since then, at least in the United States, we don't include mercury in any of our plastics. So it's something that we learned from, and you'll see here in a second that a lot of these events, we dealt with, we made life better for the populations by taking action. Uh, Power plants, coal burning power plants, can pollute water and contaminate fish. You've heard about mercury that's in certain fish, and how it can have detrimental impacts for certain populations. Lead, this is found in pipes, right? People that have lead pipes in old houses, they're now copper pipes for most people, but some people have not had their houses repiped, and so might still have some exposure to some lead pipe that comes through their water system. Gasoline emitted lead until the early 80s, when, again, you're not as old, most of you are probably not as old as I am, but we used to have regular gasoline and unleaded gasoline, right? Regular gasoline had lead in it. Unleaded did not. So they resolved that by just taking the lead out of gas. Lead paint was used until 1977. If you've ever done a real estate transaction, you have to sign something confirming that your house does not have any lead paint exposure. Arsenic, it's called the king of poisons because you might see it in a movie or something where somebody's giving arsenic directly, to end their life, if you will. Arsenic is in some drinking water, especially if you have a well and it's not really, if you have a well, it's not regulated or by the EPA, etc. Some drinking water may have 50 to 90 micrograms of arsenic per liter. U.S. government standard by the EPA is 5 micrograms. So again, if you have a well, that stuff is pretty well regulated by the EPA for general drinking water. But if you have your own well or whatever, it might be worth making sure that gets tested. Asbestos, great intentions initially when they first started using this for building material, right? It was very strong and it was fire resistant. As we came to find out later that it was, cancer causer in certain situations. So, in today's world, when we see asbestos, it has to be taken out and replaced with something more appropriate and less disease causing. Factory farms, just kind of an aside here, is that, in animals that are crowded together, like you'll see in like chicken farms and pig farms, and that it didn't used to be that way. I had some relatives that were farmers, and used to be not that way, but it is that way now, and it can produce some bad effects, by the different wastes that are gone there and then can run into the drinking water. So, like many things in our life, when we're looking at regulating or not regulating certain things, there needs to be a risk-benefit analysis done. And just absolute safety is impossible. And I use as an example, some of the people now that are looking at the current COVID situation, and they're saying that zero fatalities is the goal. That's not possible, and to put in restrictions that try to make that happen are not going to be received well, and they're not really beneficial. It's not a proper risk analysis. Over-regulation can cause under-regulation. Again, when we look at the cost of implementing something and what we get back from it, sometimes we're going to say, it's not worth it for that cost for what we're going to get in return. And that can lead to a lot of people saying, well, then I just won't do anything in many situations. And so that's how it might lead to under-regulation. Risk must be balanced against other societal goals, including economic well-being. Again, we've run into that with COVID in, whether we went back to work, the shutdowns, et cetera. Those many times weren't, but should have been balanced with the cost of the economic well-being of the group that you're trying to serve. And again, the other side of that is that sometimes, political groups or big corporations or just businesses in general will have business interests that try to trump that legislation. And the last thing, Trump did roll back some administrative and many environmental regulations, and we'll leave it at that. So let's get specifically into clean air, and is it safe to breathe, right? So that's the question we're going to ask. So we talked a little bit earlier about what I believe is significant, and I'm not the only one that believes is significant legislation that happened in 1970. So this was a Clean Water and Air Act, and what it did was it set new standards to address pollution. And I put here it's been a great success because as we look at results that have happened since 1970 in the last 50 years, it will support that. This Clean Air Act was expanded in 1990. The number of substances that they regulated went from 7 to 189. I think one of the more important things was, and this is just odd timing, and I'll tell you why in a bit, but they set safety standards for factories. And they also required that polluters and people that were in the factories and stuff that were, putting out chemicals that they use the best equipment available to try to minimize that pollution. And again, I came here to Los Angeles in 1990. I'm in hindsight, I'm guessing that those amendments were a big part of cleaning up the air here in Los Angeles compared to today versus what they were in 1990. Another thing to be encouraged about is that the EPA, they follow the air, the water, and there's a great surveillance on these things. Now, what you see in front of you here is just a screenshot on the EPA environmental, on their EPA.gov site, which allows me to go to my specific area. I live in the 92808 area code. I can see today that the air quality is good, that the forecast is going to be moderate. And you can look at 2015, they give you 2012 through 2015. In 2015, the air quality you can see was, I don't know, I'm guessing from the pie chart that it was, 30% unhealthy and maybe 20% moderate and 58% unhealthy for a sensitivity group. So just this exhibit alone run today, if you will, which is August 20th, is evidence that the air has gotten cleaner in my area. And I encourage you to go to the EPA.gov and go to this different site and look at your own area and see how things are. And you can see there, and we'll talk about water here in a second, but you can see there that they also track the quality of the water. And if you were to scroll down once you get to the website, they also have land and waste disposal sites that measure those other items too. So here's the great news, and I want to start out with the great news again, because when you start to talk about chemicals within the air and how they can impact people and how they can cause morbidity, a lot of people get scared, right? And I'm here to tell you that again, 30 years ago or 50 years ago in 1970, I would have said, yeah, maybe there's reason to be scared if I really studied it, but there is less reason to be scared now than there was before. And here is just a statement of the great news is that air pollution has decreased by 54% in the last 39, 40 years, right? And you can read through those other items, but the new passenger vehicles are 98 to 99% cleaner. And you can see this information on the EPA website also. And as you look at this chart here, you can see that use, gross domestic product, and vehicle miles traveled have all gone up, while the emissions and other exposures have pollutants have gone down. So that's great news. We should be pleased with the progress we've made. Here's just another item from the EPA website, which shows that, and this is what we've done a great job with vehicles, and we'll continue to do a great job as electric vehicles become more available and more affordable. But you can see here that from 1970 to 2021, vehicles have become much more clean. I think in 2003 was the first time I bought a zero emissions vehicle. It was a Honda Accord, and it was part of that progress that led us to where we are today, which is cleaner air because there's less exhaust from our cars. So the thing I want to point about two things about this particular exhibit is that these are air pollution events that happened. One is in London, right, 1952. And at first I want to point out that it's 1952, right? So it's 70 years ago almost. It caused almost 4,000 deaths. And the second thing I want to point out that it was a combination of air pollution and weather that caused that, which is always the case, right? The weather is whether it's hotter or colder or rainy or not rainy, has an impact on how severe pollution can be. Again, I live in Los Angeles area. I've been here for 30 years. They say the smog was bad in the 50s and 60s. It probably was worse, but in 1990 it was bad, and that has improved. In 1970, the Clean Air Act went into place, and here's the point of this slide is to show you that a lot of the severe air pollution, I'm not going to suggest that it's gone, but we have done tremendous things to improve that over the last 50 years, and we have the EPA and those people that were committed to doing that to thank. Here is another graphic that I ran from the EPA website. This is like real-time data, right? And so a couple of things I want to point out here. It measures the air quality index from, for this I ran it from 2000 to 2021. And I love pictures because it tells you a story and kind of helps you identify trends. So I put here air pollution, weather, and cars. As you can look through here, you can see the first thing I look at is that as you get into the summer months and the weather gets warmer, the air quality gets worse. Now, does that equate to us doing worse with controlling pollution? No, it doesn't at all. Weather impacts pollution, right? And the extent of that pollution. So you can see it's pretty consistent through the last 21 years or 20 and a half years that during the summer, the air quality gets a little bit worse. Another thing that I want to point out is, when we're talking about cars and how they impact it, they've impacted it less, right? But if you look at the March of 2000, like March, April of 2020, you'll see a lot of green that goes across there in March and then through April. That was a period out here in Los Angeles. And again, I should say this from Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, where we were shut down because of COVID, right? There were less cars on the road, almost zero cars on the road compared to what it normally is. So you can see there that the air quality was much better, even though we get cleaner burning cars, et cetera. When there are no cars on the road at all, the air quality was better. So what are the top air pollutants? We looked at some general, toxic chemicals that can impact us, but what are the top air pollutants? We're going to look at some of these, and we're going to go through them pretty briefly again, but we're going to look at particulate matter, carbon monoxide, ozone, sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxides, and lead. Again, I want to point out that with each one of these, what was a huge issue in the 60s and 70s and 50s has become much improved as we look through here. Particulate matter is the most visible with air pollution. The air pollutants that can be produced by combustion, like burning coal, etc. 6 studies have found that death rates were higher in the most polluted cities. So pollution, can equate to a higher incident of death for sure. They're smaller particles, so they penetrate deeper into the lungs. And a couple other things there, I'll just let you look through those, but there are additional facts on particle matter. Sulfur oxide is, again, is produced by combustion from, like coal burning, etc. Irritation of respiratory tracts can cause severe respiratory damage, can result in acid rain. So all those things sound really bad, and they are, not great. But as you can see, the levels have declined 91% between 1980 and current. Carbon monoxide, highly toxic gas. But it's part of what we do. We breathe out carbon monoxide every day. Most is produced in motor vehicle exhaust. It's especially harmful with patients with cardiovascular disease. It causes headache and mental impairment. Again, through the use of vehicles, and we'll touch on this a little bit here, I believe, is that by making vehicles cleaner burning, we have addressed this in a pretty awesome way. So nitrous oxides, main source of on-road motor vehicle exhaust. Again, nitrous oxides are responsible for yellowish-brown appearing in smog. They contribute to respiratory tract irritation, acid rain, and ozone, similar to carbon monoxide. Ozone, it's highly reactive to a variant of oxygen. Can irritate the eyes and increases mortality from cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. And then the last one is lead. Again, this is something that we talked about before. You find in pipes, in paint that's older, pipes that are older, but it has been decreased dramatically again, just like the others, in its incidence in the environment and in pollution. Other air pollutants, in 1990, the Clear Act amendments, which we talked about briefly before, that were enacted, increased the set of standards for 187 chemicals. I believe it went from 7 to 187, so it's a significant increase. But then they haven't necessarily addressed it as of 1993, and I've not studied, what additional things they looked at, but they added asbestos, mercury, and you can read those rest. So I just put this here again. This is a slide we've seen before, just to emphasize that the great progress that's been made with our air pollution, water, etc. Again, I won't spend a lot of time here, but again, the strategies for motor vehicles that most have been enacted already, especially here in California. We do a lot to control it because our air was so bad, 30, 40 years ago. So unleaded gasoline is part of that. Vapors that they put the little covers that they put over the gas things, which I don't believe exist in Indiana, but they are out here in California. Encouraging carpooling, just common sense things to get less cars on the road, if you will. Just some industrial sources to prevent air pollution. We talked a little bit about that earlier, and I won't emphasize this point too much, but the EPA works closely with factories and that sort of thing to make sure that air pollution is reduced as much as possible. So we've talked about outdoor quality. Let's just talk briefly about indoor air quality, because most of us spend a lot of time indoors, right? And so if there's asbestos in there, if there's if your air filters are not clean consistently, and other things get in there, being inside a lot can put you at greater risk, and some would suggest that you are at greater risk indoors than outdoors. But sources of indoor air pollution, I mean, tobacco smoke, if you have smokers in your house, wood burning stoves and fireplaces. Many of us might burn fireplaces, etc. Gas ranges and furnaces. I have one in my house, both of those. Radon gas. That's something we talked about briefly before about how it can come up through the soil, etc. Some other indoor exposures, formaldehyde, some stuff coming from different countries, etc. Might not be, or we don't necessarily know if they're, of high quality or if they're emitting different chemicals. Your cleaning products is a great example. So consumer products, and my wife is just very well versed on this. Is the chemicals that come out of there, the long-term exposure, can be detrimental to your health over a longer period of time. Microbes and allergens like mold and animal dander can also impact your health. So let's jump to clean water. It's a limited resource, and it really is. And as we work through, different situations that are going on right now, with drought, et cetera, the availability of water seems to be becoming more and more scarce. But let's look first at just some events that have happened that were water pollutant incidences. And one thing I want to point out here, and I apologize for the jumbled dates right here, but you can see that the most recent incident that has been recorded here is 1993. So again, I feel like that we've done a great job of at least minimizing the sort of events related to water, at least here in the United States. I mean, certainly there are other countries that are not as advanced, and there are certainly people like the Bill Gates Foundation, et cetera, that work with other countries to help them get more clean water, which is essential to our health. I just added this slide again to show you that at least in the United States, you can go to EPA.gov and you can find out what the condition of your water, what your air, et cetera. So a great resource to be able to look to and give you some comfort that not only is there being progress made with the environment, but also in your area, what that looks like. So the federal legislation, like the Clean Air Act, there was the Clean Water Act in 1972. There was a Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974. And then, as you can see, there were certain amendments that were made there. So the key idea of the Clean Water Act was that lakes and rivers should be fishable and swimmable, right? So they shouldn't be polluted to the point where we've killed the fish, and by getting in the water, there's somehow a dangerous exposure to being able to swim in there. So it makes a lot of sense, right? That we need to have water that's clean enough to fish and to swim in. The Clean Water Act identifies different sources of pollution as point source pollution or non-point source pollution. And point source pollution are things such as factories, sewage treatment plants, where they are the direct single source of the pollution, right? And how do they manage that? Non-point source pollution can be something like agricultural runoff, where they're watering their crops, and as that water gets into the soil or runs to the ocean or runs to some sort of body of water, it can pick up several different contaminants along the way and cause problems with water. So nearly half of the drinking water comes from rivers and lakes, and this is the surface water that we're talking about, and that where the non-point pollution would come from. So this surface water can be, like the rivers and lakes, can be contaminated by other chemicals that come not necessarily directly from the water, but are polluted there. Also, community water treatment is to produce portable water, And then also the Clean Water Act also has had some great amendments that allow it to just get better and better, and those have happened over the last decade or so. So just a couple other tidbits. EPA has set standards for 87 identified contaminants. And I'll let you read through the rest of that there. I think that's all pretty well self-explanatory. Just a couple other notes. I mean, private wells are not regulated by the Safe Water Drinking Act. Most bottled water that you'll find is from a municipal water source. And lead problems are still a concern in many cities just because the plumbing or the infrastructure there has not been updated from the lead pipes that still exist. Shortages of portable water. Most water on the Earth's surface is salt water or ice. Now, there's some that would suggest, and I'm a fan of this, is that we should look more into desaltinization of the ocean, but we'll see if that ever gains any traction. Less than 1% of fresh water is suitable for drinking. Water shortage exists in much of the world. I live in California. We're currently in like a drought sort of situation, so certainly that is an issue in certain parts of the country. And political disputes already occur often about who should be using the water. Out here in California, we talk about why certain crops are grown out here that require lots of water when that water could be used for drinking or doing other things. So let's talk about solid and hazardous waste, what to do with the garbage. So in regard to waste management, in the 1970s, certain practices were outlawed. The first were open dumps. They were outlawed by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And garbage that was burned in incinerators or in the open was also outlawed by the Clean Air Act of 1970. And garbage was poured in rivers or lakes or oceans, again, was outlawed by the Clean Air Act of 1972. Sanitary landfills, just some of the things that needed to be done there. They were infecting the soil, so they needed to be lined with plastics. These were the solutions that we put in place. Drained of liquids, vented to controlled and explosive gases. The big example of like the poorly managed thing was the New York City Fresh Kill landfill on Staten Island. Said a lot about our garbage crisis and how we need to do a better job of managing how we dispose of our waste. So alternatives to landfills. These are just general thoughts on how we can best manage the resources that we have. We can reduce what we use, right? We can reuse certain items that don't necessarily have to be disposable, and we could also recycle. And I think in most parts of the U.S. anyway now, I mean, recycling is big, and most corporations are working to manage the amount of plastic, cardboard, all that goes through things. And if they do use a bunch of it, then they work to recycle it. Waste to energy incineration, still a pollution concern, and there are certain places where it is not allowed. California is one of those states. You cannot burn your trash here in California. So hazardous waste is managed by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, and then also an amendment in 1984. It manages all hazardous waste that has to be accounted for from cradle to grave. So when it's created to when it's disposed of, it has to be followed and figured out where it is. Waste from petroleum, refining, pesticide manufacturing, and some pharmaceuticals are also managed. And ignitable, corrosive, and reactive toxic wastes are also managed by that particular act. There was a Superfund that was created in 1980. They required emergency cleanup of old waste sites. That got unfunded, I believe, and was not reauthorized after 1995. So the current status of that, I'm not certain what it is, but that was set up to try to clean up the landfills. So safe food and drugs and ongoing regulatory battle is what we've said here. Uh, causes of foodborne illness, you've seen these terms before: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. So there's some disjointedness and major inconsistencies that exist in how the food safety is managed. And here's just a few examples. The responsibility of certain agencies. The USDA is responsible for managing meat, poultry, processed eggs, and then also the Food and Drug Administration is all other foods, except for certain states have to regulate shellfish, and then state and local governments, regulate stores, restaurants, and institutions. So you can see there's a disjointedness there, and can cause problems. But I think for the most part, together they're able to accomplish what they need to. There's also a little bit of inconsistency and irrationality of the system in that the USDA has a bigger budget and more authority. So they regulate only 20% of the food, and yet they have a larger budget. And then the FDA has a smaller budget and has less authority for the 80% of the regulation of the food. So just something that doesn't make perfect sense, but again, we don't do an awful job in this country of managing our food sources. So the EPA, sets tolerance levels for different pesticide residues, the amount of hormones, antibiotics, organic foods, and additives. In regards to the management of drugs, the FDA is involved in this, and they basically, a company will file a new drug application. I have a friend that is, currently working to get an Alzheimer's treatment drug approved, and this goes through 3 phases. They do testing on a small number of folks, then they test a larger number, and then they'll do a full-scale, controlled trial. Now, these can take a long time. I mean, beginning to end, it can take years for some of these drugs to get approved. So food and drug labeling is important. I mean, when we need information, we want to make sure that it's there and that it's of high quality and that it's consistent with what is in certain drugs and or foods. So that's when we'll move past a little bit because it's kind of self-explanatory in that we want to make sure that we know what's going into our bodies. The Dietary and Supplementary Health and Education Act was passed in 1994. It forbids the FDA from regulating herbs and food supplements. This is something that I mean, didn't used to be a supplement taker. Now I am. I believe that it does make a difference. Now there are challenges with it in that they're not, many of them are not tested well. You're not sure exactly if what it says on the label is what's in there, and that's part of the challenges of these supplements that aren't necessarily managed by the FDA. But again, if you can get them from a reliable source, that they've been properly tested, I believe that they can help. The politics at the FDA, there's complaints that they're subject to intense political pressure, which is true. The FDA is too slow in approving drugs, is what the drug companies will say. Some drug companies pay a fee to speed up the review process, and some drug companies are involved to make sure their drug gets approved. And just complaints that the FDA is too cozy with the industry, and that they are in cahoots with a lot of people, and that they might do some things that aren't completely moral. Just a few more items on politics in the FDA. I'll let you read through those, and we'll move forward. So I want you to contemplate, and again, there's nothing you have to do formally here, but discuss the pros and cons for the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. Right? I mean, it's something that, again, we don't know for certain sometimes what's in the dietary supplements. It's become more and more with integrative and functional medicine, something that more of us will be exposed to. So just think about that for a bit. So the last thing we're going to talk about is population and as the ultimate environmental health issue. So how does our environment, impact availability to resources, right? Our environment has a certain capacity, and we need to continue to look at whether we're at that capacity, a long ways from that capacity. So here is a world population forecast for between now and the year 2050. So it's predicted that between now 2020, which we're actually in 2021, but 2020, there's about almost 8 trillion, 7.75 trillion people in the world. By 2050, which is 30 years from now, it's expected to be 2 trillion more people in the world. So it just gives us pause to think through, what is our capacity? What is the amount of resources where we can continue to live good and healthy lives? So in understanding what our current capacity is, these are just two examples of like growth curves. So what can happen? One is a exponential growth phase where it grows super fast and then it levels out, right? And it levels out below our current capacity to support all those individuals in the way that we want to. The second is the J curve, which essentially means that we go past our capacity to manage, for our resources to be able to handle the amount of population. And some big event happens, like there's too many people, so we can't feed all the people. And so that results in many deaths from starvation, which takes us back below the carrying capacity. Kind of a survival of the fittest, if you will, sort of scenario. So let's look at population biology and just the elements of that. So population biology is a science. We just talked a little bit about the S and J curves and how they are two general patterns in population growth. The carrying capacity is the number of organisms that can be supported without degrading the environment, right? And also, as I gave as an example, the more serious consequences that what if we don't have enough food to support people, and that results in death. Now, Thomas Malthus predicted in 1800 that population growth would outgrow food supply. He was not the only one. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published a book called The Population Bomb, and what he said that that 10 million kids and people in the world would die of hunger every year in the 1970s. And he wrote this book in 1968. Now that didn't come to pass. It didn't come to pass for many reasons, but one was because we became better at agriculture. We became better at producing food, and we can talk long about what that has resulted in, that maybe was unintended consequences, but we have been able at this point to be able to feed the world's population for the most part. I understand that there are countries where that food is scarce and there is food urgency in those areas. And it's true that population growth has slowed, but the effects of overpopulation are occurring, and we need to make sure, if anything, that Paul Ehrlich had taught us was that at least we need to be paying attention to this and planning for what might be the consequences if we were to get to the point where we're at the carrying capacity of our environment. So again, as we said on the previous slide, we want to make sure that we are looking at population growth and trying to figure out, how much capacity we have left. And one thing is, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but our goal is to make people more healthy, right? To extend their life and to make the quality of their life better. But to what extent does that contribute to population growth? I mean, it's really pretty simply math, is that the longer the life expectancy, the more that the world is going to be populated. Now, there are other things that impact world population. For example, the birth rate in the United States has actually gone down over the last generation or so. And part of that reason is that people are getting married later. They are research tends to be the people that are more educated and that live in a more affluent environment. Maybe have less kids than those that are on at a different level. So anyway, there's a lot of things that impact population growth. But one thing is our population grows too that I want to talk about is that as our world gets more and more crowded, right? Then in areas where it's more crowded, India, China, those areas are more susceptible to when you're closer together, you're more susceptible to infectious disease. Uh, you know, just simply put, spreading things if you're closer together and uh, more close. So depletion of global resources. I mean, fresh water. Uh, the there's a small percentage of our Earth's water that's suitable for human use. We talked about that before. It's unevenly distributed, right? Some people have better access to water in the world than others. Um, you know, we use it for drinking, cooking, washing, agriculture. There's debates out here in California as to whether areas where there's more rain, et cetera, that wouldn't be better for them to grow the crops there versus us taking water and making that here. You can see the other things here that deplete the global resources. So we've talked this week about how we manage the environment to bring best outcomes for our population, and that's included, how we manage chemicals that cause disease, how we manage air quality, how we manage water quality, how we manage food and drug quality, and then the last was how we manage population growth in order to make sure that we have enough capacity. So that brings us to this the question for this week. Your discussion question is going to be what are three or more factors that may determine the carrying capacity of the Earth? And then explain the effect of each factor. And I'm going to give you a couple clues here into the question. And number one is that there are certain things they're called abiotic and biotic. Abiotic limiting factors are non-living organisms in an ecosystem. So things like sunlight, temperature, soil, water, oxygen, right? And just space to live, right? So, and then the biotic is going to be food, disease, and weather. I want you to look at each of these things, and just give some thoughts and analysis on how these factors might impact the carrying capacity of the Earth. We're doing a pretty good job of managing. When I say we, the public health space, is doing a pretty good job of managing, air pollution, these other things. I think the last 50 years we've made great strides. One of the things that doesn't often get talked about, though, is when is there not enough what happens when there's not enough resources in order to sustain people, at the way that allows them to continue to thrive, if you will. So we will see you next week to talk about how the medical community interacts with public health. That'll be our last week. Your paper is due this week. So good luck on that, and we look forward to seeing lots of good information on those papers. So take care.